We're fortunate to have Dr. Jocelyn Peltier-Huntley with us. I'll just share very briefly about her. So Dr. Peltier-Hunter is both an EDI researcher and a professional mechanical engineer with a 20 plus years of experience leading change. She is now a globally recognized authority on activating workplaces allies with a few awards to her name, including being recognized as an EDI champion by Engineers Canada. So her work has contributed meaningfully to help socially conscious organizations to be strategic about advancing EDI. So granted, with the extensive expertise and perspective, we're very fortunate to have her with us today to share insights on how we can support diversity in engineering through inclusive leadership. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peltier Hunter.
Thank you so much, Godswill. And I will just share screens here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much to Saskatoon Engineering Society for having me here tonight too. So excited to get to close out Engineering Month, National Engineering Month, and I'm going to talk a little bit about engineering in particular, and also it was International Women's Day in March as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. So just interested to know, and I know everyone's got cameras off and everything, but if you want to put it in the chat, you can either use an emoji or you can even just put the number one in the chat. But I'm wondering if any of you have ever walked into a room and you've had your credibility or your qualifications questioned. So put a one in the chat or put an emoji out if you've ever felt like you've had your credibility questioned. Okay, I see some ones. See some ones coming up there. So, me too. And I should say too, so more ones coming up. Perfect. So we're going to talk about some of those challenges today. And I should say too, just my slide here, the prairies reminds me that I'm joining from Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Perhaps many of you are joining from Saskatoon as well. And just wanted to do that land acknowledgement to start us off too. So, I spent the first 13 years of my career as a professional engineer in the mining sector, and oftentimes I was the only woman in the room. So, I knew what it felt like to have your credibility and qualifications questioned. I had that experience quite a bit. And often I was the only woman in the room, the only woman in the engineering department. And when I moved into a leadership role, I was one of a few who didn't have a stay-at-home spouse to care for my two children. When I looked around the leadership table, when I arrived there, most people did have a stay-at-home spouse, and I didn't. I was working out at a mine about an hour out of Saskatoon, and my husband was very busy when my children were little. He was also working. He's an engineer, works in consulting as well, and he was very busy, getting the kids to and from daycare and going to work. And because of my longer shifts, I would sneak out of the house when everyone was sleeping and come home, and generally it was supper time. So definitely felt some differences there. And at times, because of my gender and stereotypical beliefs about what an engineer should look like, sometimes I was mistaken for an admin assistant rather than the professional, even when people could maybe clearly see my ring and I wasn't wearing gloves out in the plant or something like that. And if I led with empathy and curiosity, or if I took a collaborative approach to problem solving, I wasn't always recognized as being a strong leader. I was told I was being too friendly. And in the male dominated workplaces where I worked, I didn't always feel like I fit the leadership mold or the professional mold that seemed to be given for others around me. So at times I felt like I was in these two different worlds. There was professional version of me and kind of family version. I'll tell a story about these two pictures here. So when I received advice from my well-meaning, often male mentors, it didn't always fit right for me. What had worked for them when I tried to do, similar things that they had found successful in their career, it didn't always have the same results for me. So it felt like I was in these two different worlds, and at times I wasn't acting in line with my own values. And so this picture on the left here, me in my PPE with my respirator, this was at my first job when I was working out at a lead zinc smelter in British Columbia. And there was a photographer coming around. They were doing this photo book to celebrate the site being 100 years old. Oh, you're not seeing slides. Okay. Try going to the different tab maybe at the top of Zoom and see if you can see them that way.
Yeah. Yes, some of us, I think, should still be seeing it. I'm seeing
Okay.
it currently.
you might be seeing God's Will slide still. So if you look at the top of Zoom, you might be able to click over and see mine. Does that help, Edwin? Okay, good, good. All right. Okay, so you see this picture of me here on the left in my PPE. And so what was happening is this photographer was coming around and they were taking pictures of different people across the organization. And so they decided to take my picture. I got asked to have my picture taken. And there was another young engineer, male engineer that was a friend of mine. He got his picture taken too. And so I remember when they were taking this picture because of the glare off the glasses, my safety glasses actually were kind of like up into my hard hat because otherwise they were reflecting so much you couldn't see my eyes. And so a few of us got our pictures taken, but then my picture, because I was, one of the few women in the group, young woman, young engineer, my picture ended up getting everywhere. It was on like one of those 6 foot tall roll up banners. I was at career fairs. I was at posters all over, probably on the website, and got my picture in this book too. So I was kind of like all over the place, my picture. And it felt a little bit tokenizing sometimes actually, because why was my picture kind of being displayed everywhere as the face of diversity? And then flash forward to this picture here on the right. So my daughters are teenagers. They both play soccer. They really love soccer. And last year we got to take them to see a Northern Super League game. And so Northern Super League is the first women's professional soccer league in Canada. It just started last year, and so we took them to Vancouver so that they could see a professional women's soccer game, which was really cool because not only were all the players women, but the refs, the linesmen, the coaches, all the support staff were all women. So it was really cool to see not just women, being tokenized as athletes, but really all these opportunities for women to kind of succeed and have careers in sports. So that was kind of a difference that I saw kind of reflecting back to earlier in my career. So at times, but feeling like I was in these two different worlds. There was like professional me and personal me in my life. And that worked up into the point when it didn't. So a few years ago, I faced a crisis in my personal life, and I couldn't keep my two worlds separate. So you can see how little my kids were here in this picture, but my dad had been a lawyer and a farmer in Southwest Saskatchewan, and he was diagnosed with esophageal cancer. And so when he got diagnosed with cancer, he left his law practice to focus on treatment. He kept farming. But about a year and a half into his battle with cancer, treatment seemed to be working. And so my parents, this is at a golf course in Southwest Saskatchewan. And my parents really loved golfing. That was something that they liked to do together. And so they decided to go on a vacation because dad had just got a scan back showing no cancer. And so they booked a trip to go to Prince Edward Island. And so they would call and give us updates about who had beat who in golf, what kind of great seafood they were eating. And then one update they called and it wasn't such good news. Um, Dad had beat mom in the last game of golf, but then he started to have some issues with his balance. And so they went to the emergency room in Charlottetown. He had a CT scan and it showed that he had a golf ball sized tumor in his brain. So they cut their vacation short and they came straight back to Saskatoon, went to emergency at RUH. And my dad had waited for emergency brain surgery for a few days. So it was a stressful few days. We knew there was a lot of risks. And after dad had his surgery, we got to see him and we felt a lot better going home that night because he was articulate and coherent and he was excited that his surgery had gone well too. And he wasn't sure kind of what long-lasting impacts there might have been from it. Um, but in the following few days, there were complications and his brain swelled and there was a follow-up surgery. And he never really fully regained his ability to articulately and coherently speak. He struggled with, following even just listening to TV or reading. He couldn't really do that afterwards. And that had been something he really loved to do, was to read and to learn. He had this tendency that kind of continued for the rest of his life where he would still lose his balance. So then he couldn't really be left alone because he could tip over. And so, in a lot of ways, it felt like when my dad had his brain surgery that I kind of lost him. And at that point, I felt like I couldn't keep my personal and my professional life separate. And so, when that happened, I went into work. When we knew that dad had this brain tumor, I took a leave of absence. And then, when he finally got out of the hospital 6 weeks later, I went and gave my 2 weeks notice. So my dad lived for another 6 months, but in many ways it felt like I lost him when he had that brain surgery. So probably, maybe, hopefully, you haven't had to go through something like this in your life. But at times, I would suspect there's maybe you felt like you've had to split yourself into two, who you are in your personal life and who you are at work. At home, maybe you're trying to be like me and trying to be, that empathetic, caring, patient parent, partner that you'd like to be. I'm not always that all the time, but it's what I strive to do. And at work, trying to be that assertive, stoic, polished professional. But wouldn't it be nice if we could just be seen as a whole person? I want people to know me for all the aspects of make up who I am. So I'm a woman, I'm an engineer, a caregiver, I play hockey, make sourdough bread, I love to garden, love to travel. And I'd love to know others by their multifaceted roles and passions too. So today I'm going to talk about how to live your whole life, live your life as a whole person by activating your allies and helping others live their best lives by being an active ally. So we can make small changes and we can create this positive ripple of change. And I miss telling the story, but I can come back to it. So, as we mark the end of National Engineering Month, I'm going to ask you to consider the power of inclusive leadership or allyship. And together we can reflect on diversity, belonging, and the power you hold as professionals to create a sustainable, resourceful future where everyone can achieve their full potential. And we know from many studies that to achieve innovative and more profitable engineering solutions, we need diverse perspectives. If we want to get to tackling some of the complex challenges that exist in the world, we need diversity. And we can leverage diverse perspectives and develop better solutions to complex problems by acting as inclusive leaders and active allies. So I just want to come back to this what slide here and just tell a quick story around it. So this was kind of another full circle moment, kind of like taking my daughters to that soccer game last year where I got to bring my kids to work. So this is in Sydney, Australia, and when I was doing my PhD, I had some really great funding from a few different sources, and I got to go present at a mining conference in Brisbane, Australia, and then it worked out well. It was kind of near the end of the school year, and we took the kids along, and all of us went. So it was really neat because I kind of got to bring them to work, and they got to see me at a conference. And then one really neat thing, if you've had a chance to go to Sydney, they have an architectural tour, which I really think it should be called an engineering tour, just but maybe they wouldn't sell as many tickets if it was called an engineering tour. But really, a lot of the tour talked about kind of the engineering challenges and some of the different things that went into building this beautiful building here. So recommend checking it out if you have a chance to be there. Okay. Back to the program here. So if you take nothing else away from the talk today, and I'm going to make this interactive, and I'm going to ask you to, if you have a phone with you, you can scan a QR code in a minute here, and I can also paste a link in the chat too if you're on a laptop or a desktop. You can access it that way. But if you take nothing else away from my talk today, I'm not asking you to change who you are at your core to be accepted as a professional or a leader. Instead, I'm asking you to make a few small changes in your professional practice. And as each of us adopts an inclusive leadership practice, we can create this positive ripple of change. And you can do this by calling in your partner, your coworkers, your boss, and others in your community to ally with you and create this positive ripple of change where everyone can achieve their full potential. So I'm going to talk about four different things, and I'm going to go a little bit off of my book here and this model on the front cover here. And we're going to talk about this ally activation model and kind of the stages of allies that will help us with being more inclusive leaders and helping us with creating a more diverse engineering profession. So there's four main things we're going to talk about. The first one is raising awareness by learning and talking about challenges that you or others may face at home or at work. We're going to talk about the importance of support systems. So sometimes that means telling or asking for support within your support network, letting people know what support looks like for you. And if you're in a position where you're like, no, I'm fine, I don't really need help right now, then you are probably well positioned to offer support to others. So we'll talk about what that looks like. Third, we're going to talk about micro acts of inclusion. So sometimes when we might think about allyship or advocacy, we might think of the really big things, but there's little things that we can do in our everyday behavior, and that's what I want you to start thinking about. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is how to make it sustainable. So recognizing and reinforcing active allyship behaviors, there's likely already a lot of good happening around you. There's probably some good things that you're already doing. So really just trying to magnify those things and reinforce those things. Okay, let's get into a pre-assessment, a little bit of interactive piece here. So if you have a smartphone with you with a camera, you can just go to camera mode and you can scan this QR code here. I will also put this in the chat here too. And you can go to menti.com and you can enter in this code here. So hopefully that works in the chat here too. I am just gonna, okay. And sometimes on my slides here, it doesn't always load right away. So if we go like this, just how this thing is showing up here. Okay. I'm gonna try to go back. Okay, good. We got some answers coming through. So I can see we've got 3 people that have answered so far. And it's kind of neat because as people answer, then it shifts around a little bit. So what we can see here, and this is really, really common, oftentimes people, actually this isn't super common, but it's very interesting. So oftentimes people understand diversity. Okay, but the link in the chat didn't, but the QR code worked. Okay. I can see that we got a few people in here. Oh, we got 5 in. Okay, good. So, so what we see here is people are feeling like inclusion is feeling pretty comfortable, which is good to know. Diversity maybe a little bit less so. I'm going to explain what these terms are too, and it'll be interesting to see when we go through if people change their opinions about things. And Juniper and I were talking a little bit about the backlash that's kind of propped up in the last year. And usually I think the backlash is because people don't quite understand equity. And so we'll talk about that. And then intersectionality is an important term that we'll talk about as well. Not just seeing this kind of through one lens, but looking at it, people who may belong to more than one equity deserving group and just challenges that they may face. Okay. So, do we understand our role as potential allies? Some think yes, and some are unsure. And so there's no right or wrong answers, just kind of interested to see where people are feeling about these things. And then what are you most wanting to learn about today? How can we support others in an honest, supportive, and authentic ally as an honest, supportive, and authentic ally, and understanding the range of what we can do. So those sound great. And we will leave the last one for now. So let's get into some of the challenges. And the engineering profession, I think, especially has some challenges, and we have a history of it, right? And so earlier this year, or at the end of last year, I should say, in about November, end of October, I was in Montreal and I went on a bit of a hike over top of Mount Royal and went to École Polytechnique because I wanted to see this monument here. And from the pictures I've seen, I was thinking it would be quite large actually, but it's not actually that big. I was standing quite close to the wall. It wasn't as big as I thought it was going to be, but I was really glad that it was a beautiful day and that I got to go find it. And of course, if some of you know the story around this, which I'm sure you probably do around École Polytechnique, you know that this story is disturbing and it might be triggering as well. So I just want to say, like, please take care of yourself too. If you need to take a break from this conversation or if you need to seek out support afterwards, please do. But I do want to share it because it's something that I think about not just around December 6th, which is the anniversary of when this happened, but it's something I think about throughout the year, maybe because of some of the elements of the story, which I'll share. But now, because of this event that happened, December 6th is recognized as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. So even though we're not in December, I think it's important to recognize because it's National Engineering Month and it was International Women's Day in March as well. So last December 6th marked the 36th anniversary of the Ecole Polytechnique massacre. And so what happened in 1989 on December 6th is a lone gunman went into the mechanical engineering class at Ecole Polytechnique in Montreal with a semi-automatic gun and a hunting knife. And like I said, I'm a mechanical engineer. And so he ordered the men to leave the room and he lined up the women against the wall and he shot them. And over the next 20 minutes, he killed 14 women and he injured 14 more people, including 3 men, before he killed himself. And so I think about this not just around December 6th, because I think about, what were the early warning signs? What things could have prevented that? How could things have maybe been different? And 3 years ago, my friend Lena Thomas and we published an opinion piece with Post Media through the Star Phoenix, and then it was shared across Canada. And so Lena is also a mechanical engineer. And so we met when we were going back to do graduate studies focused on more the social side of work. And so her second graduate degree, she has two graduate degrees, but her second one was focused on women and gender studies. And so in our article, we reflected on the Ecole Polytechnique massacre and our experiences that we had through our career that it propelled us at one point away from engineering and the need for allyship as a means to ensure the retention of women in engineering. And so there's been lots of studies done to kind of try to understand what some of the challenges are. And there are some challenges in the pipeline leading to enough women choosing to go into the profession for sure. But there's also a lot of challenges around retention and culture that happen afterwards. So when we're talking about allyship, it's more my focus around it was more to try to address some of the retention issues that happen once people have chosen that profession that they're in. And it doesn't just apply to engineering, but it is something that we're mostly talking about today. So when we're thinking about just going back to that poll and understanding equity, diversity, and inclusion, understanding these terms, I think, is a little bit of a journey, and it's shaped by our identity. And so there's different ways we might describe our identities, and those are really elements of diversity. So diversity is this measure of variety. It's related to how we might describe ourselves in different ways, maybe related to our gender, our race, our ethnicity, our abilities, sexual orientation, life stage that we're at, our age, and many more factors. And there are many protected grounds outlined in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and in provincial or territorial human rights codes. So, in line with privacy laws, we can ask people about how they identify, as long as we're clear on how their data is going to be used and safeguarded. And this is when we can start to understand maybe where there's gaps. Where is there gaps in representation? Where are there gaps in people's experiences? But first, we need that diversity data. So inclusion is the next concept, and that's the one where people are feeling like they maybe understood it the most. So inclusion is this active and it's intentional practice, and it acknowledges and celebrates our differences. So it acknowledges those diversity aspects, and inclusion is really about interpersonal connections and interpersonal relationships. And to feel included, we need two key elements. So we need psychological safety, and we need a sense of belonging. And so this one's a little bit trickier to measure because we can't just get people to fill out a survey and maybe check boxes. We have to dig a little bit deeper. We have to understand interactions between individuals. And this can be a challenge sometimes to highlight when there's differences in inclusion. So we might look around and we might see visible aspects of diversity, but it's hard to look around and see visible aspects of inclusion or exclusion sometimes. We might notice some of these things, but also those who don't face challenges in the same ways as others might not always notice when people aren't being included. So sometimes what we can see happening, and especially for those that might be in senior leadership roles, they think, oh no, this is a great place to be. I feel like I belong here. I feel really safe to speak up and share my opinions. And they might not see that not everyone feels that same way and has that same experience. And so it's especially true for those who are from underrepresented or equity deserving groups that they may face additional challenges and experience less psychological safety and a lower sense of belonging at times. And so the five equity deserving groups that I talk about in my book and in my work are women, Indigenous people, racialized people, persons with disabilities, and 2S LGBTQI+. And I picked those five. Four of them are in the Federal Employment Equity Act. 2S LGBTQI+ people are not currently included in there, although there was a recommendation a couple years ago to include them in the next revision. So that's inclusion. And then the last one is equity. And equity is the one I think that people maybe often understand the least, although people are on this call today are feeling like they maybe understand it a little bit more. But equity is about a means of fairness according to one's needs. And so to achieve equal outcomes, we need systems and processes which give equity deserving groups or equity deserving individuals additional supports at times. So there might need to be additional accommodations. And so equity is different than equality. Equality assumes that everyone might benefit from the same measure of treatment, but fails to recognize that we're not all starting from the same point. So an example that I like to give is around shoe size. So my feet are size 6.5 in women's, 4.5 in men's, 37 if you know European sizing. So I have pretty small feet probably for an average adult. And if I wanted to be equal and make everyone wear my size shoes, probably it would be very uncomfortable for most people and they would find them too small. Maybe some would even find them too big. And if we applied that across society and made everyone, including children, wear my size shoes, it just wouldn't work, right? But instead, we let people pick the shoes that work best for them, for the tasks that they're doing, and that is a fair or more equitable way to do things. So that's just a simple example around it. But when we just coming back to diversity, so just to share some of the stats around diversity and understand some of the representation gaps that exist, thinking about maybe where you work, or I'll touch on the engineering profession too as we go through. But in the Canadian population, we're about 50% men, 50% women. The engineering profession overall in Canada is only 15% of the practicing professionals are women. So quite a big difference. You've probably heard of Engineers Canada 30 by 30 goal. As of 2020, I don't know what the numbers are right now, but as of 2020, I think they had reached 20%. And that's newly registered engineers. So that's just people as they're coming out of post-secondary. So a bit of a gap there between those newly registered and those overall in the profession. When we look at another equity deserving group, so Indigenous people within Canada are about 5% of the population. Higher in Saskatchewan, it's 16%, but yet only 1% of the engineering profession. Engineers Canada had done some work on this a few years ago, only 1% of the engineering profession. So pretty big gap there compared to 5% of the population. Racialized people are non-white, non-Indigenous people. And so this group is more than 25% of Canadians would fall into this group. In the past, this group was called visible minorities, and the terminology has been shifting around that because in a lot of urban centers, racialized people make up a pretty large majority of the population. So minority didn't really seem like quite the right word. And so in the engineering profession, I don't really know the numbers. I haven't seen that data. I would suspect, though, that there's probably still a bit of a gap there. And then the next group is persons with disabilities. And again, I don't know the numbers relative to the engineering profession. I haven't seen that anyone has done that work, but the population is about 27% of people identify as having a disability. And I would suspect that number will probably increase over time as our population ages and as more people get access to diagnoses as well. That group is interesting because even if you don't currently belong to it, it's a group that should you live long enough that you may end up in at some point in your life as well. And then the last group is 2S LGBTQI plus people. And so Canada actually was the first country to do some work in this area to try to understand what percent of the population might belong to this group. And so a couple of years ago, they did this work and they found 4% overall of the population identify as 2S LGBTQI plus. But in younger populations, those numbers are more like 10% or even higher. So when I'm talking about it, usually I'm saying, let's aim for closer to 10% when we're thinking about representation within organizations or professions, because that's probably closer to where it maybe should be. Thinking about all these diversity aspects, just wanted to highlight again that human rights are enshrined in our Constitution. So, we do get a lot of media and content that comes from the US, and there's been a lot of shifts and changes there over the last year or so. And so, I just want to highlight that. Even though there might be shifts happening in other places, and at times even some backtracking that looks to be happening in Canada, these human rights are enshrined in our Constitution, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's not as easy to shift these things, I think, in Canada. And that's just something to keep in mind, too. So, as you kind of reflect on those numbers and some of the diversity stats that I've shared, just really thinking about your organization, who you engage with on kind of a daily, weekly, monthly basis, maybe your clients or the public, or those from other groups that you might be engaging with. Do you think you're really getting a representative sample of the Canadian public in who you're talking to, or are you maybe missing different demographics? And so, whose perspective might be missing? And how can you more proactively engage with them so that when you're thinking about the work that you're doing, the solutions that you're designing, are you really making sure that they're going to work for a broad range of people, or are we just making sure that they're going to look for, someone who looks like me or someone who looks like you? So that's something to just reflect on afterwards. Okay, let's get into allyship. So, allyship, how I define it after studying it for 4 years, is it's a practice of inclusion where, through listening, learning, and reflection on personal experiences and privileges, people can actively support historically marginalized persons and communities in achieving their full potential. And so, some of the work that I did around allyship, and this is on the front cover of my book here too, is this ally activation model. And so, we developed this model by interviewing 17 different people who were identified by their peers as being active allies. And in wanting to develop the model, I was wanting to understand, how do people go from just living their lives to wanting to actively work to support other people? And so, how the model works is that it assumes that people start off in a state of unawareness, where we kind of think that the world is just a fair place, and if you work hard, everyone can get ahead. And then usually what happens is, in this awareness stage here, something happens where we become aware of differences and hardships and challenges. And so maybe it's some sort of active bias where we experience or witness discrimination or harassment. So some sort of differential treatment. And we realize that, there's some negative impacts to that. And so usually after that happens, whoever had that bad thing happen to them, they go on a bit of a support seeking mission. And they're looking to try to make sense of what's happening. They're looking to maybe to try to right wrongs that happened. And what can happen is, if at this stage, if people don't get the right support that they need, if they go asking for help and are told no, or invalidated in some way, oftentimes I think this is when people will leave. So they might leave the profession they're in, they might leave the workplace they're at, they might leave the industry that they're in, and they'll go look for somewhere else that maybe is a better, safer fit for them. And so if there's the right ecosystem in place, and people don't leave, and they are believed and they're validated. And so then both the person who had the bad thing happen and maybe the person who, helped offer some support, they both go on to a series of realizing moments. So these are these like light bulb growth moments, where people start to fill in gaps in their understanding in history. They do a little bit of self-reflection and like inward work too, and understanding who they are as a person, why they might have different beliefs and values and those kind of things. And oftentimes people seek out other people to learn and grow with. So they might do some reading and learning on their own, but oftentimes they look to gravitate towards other people who they can talk about these things with, and kind of work through solutions with. And so then what happens when people get to the leading change stage is that oftentimes then they are really highly motivated, and they've developed some skills through those realizing stages and the support seeking stages, so that they're better able to support other people. And people might go through this model multiple times. And so you go through it, I think, based on different aspects of identity. So for me, as a woman working in a male-dominated profession and industry, I went through it first based on my understanding of gender, and then became curious around, how might this be different, or workplaces different, or what kind of challenges might there be for Indigenous people and racialized people and persons with disabilities and 2S LGBTQI plus people? So I think we can go through it multiple times and maybe even multiple times based on different aspects of intersectionality too. So where people might belong to more than one of those groups, how might the challenges they face be different than maybe how I might experience them? So that's the ally activation model. And then from there, we developed the Active Allies course. And so it's about 10 hours of content. We tested it out first in the engineering college at the University of Saskatchewan, and then we tested it out in the mining sector. And so we had about over 100 people go through it during the research part of the project. And now I offer that course through my company, and I actually have a cohort that's starting this week on it. So I run it a few times a year. We invited people back who had helped us with forming this allyship model, and we had a videography crew, and so we created about an hour and a half worth of professionally produced video. Part of it's me and another instructor teaching concepts, and then part of it is 8 other people sharing their stories and kind of giving examples of how these things work in practice too, what allyship looks like in practice, and where some of the pitfalls and shortfalls of allyship are too, because nothing's perfect. So that's the Active Allies course. And then the other element of it, I wanted to just make sure this information was accessible to people and recognizing that not everyone wants to read a dissertation. So published this book last year too. And you can find it if you're in Saskatoon. It's at McNally Robinson and USAS Bookstore and Turning the Tide Bookstore. And then the last piece that I'll say around allyship too, at the end of the slides, I have a self-assessment free download too. So that's my gift to all of you at the end of National Engineering Month here. If you would like some support with figuring out how you can enact an allyship practice or add allyship into your engineering practice, professional practice. So, just coming back to those challenges too that I was talking about before, I kind of talked over a little bit high level, but thinking about kind of the École Polytechnique massacre too. I'll walk you through just this triangle that I developed when I was doing my master's research. So I was kind of interested to understand, thinking about the health and safety triangle. Some of you might be familiar with that from the work that you do, but the idea behind that being that we have kind of more serious health and safety incidents that occur at the top of the period, and then we have less frequent or more frequent but less harmful events that are at the bottom of the pyramid. And so I came across in my research that there's a similar pattern with gender-based violence too. So imagine if we're kind of comparing, taking the health and safety triangle, now we're going to talk about gender-based violence. At the top, we have serious incidents involving, physical harm or murder, like in the École Polytechnique case. And below that, we might have harassment or bullying type behavior. Below that would be discrimination, and below that is microaggressions. So just like we can learn from near miss incidents to prevent fatalities in health and safety, we can learn to recognize and intervene when microaggressions occur to prevent more serious incidents. So some of the work that I did then in my master's was just trying to understand kind of how these things maybe played out. And this question that I ask that I do through a lot of my work actually ask this question, tell me about a time when you witnessed or experienced discrimination or harassment. And so even though I was asking this question in my master's in the mining sector, which is about 15% women, 85% men. Most of the people who told me about a time when something bad happened were women, even though the majority of the people answering the survey were not. And so what I found in this is that underreporting is a really big issue. So out of 100 incidents, 53% of time did somebody speak up, and only 22% of time did somebody file a formal complaint. And so because there was such infrequent speaking up and kind of formalizing under doing investigations into these things, only 17% of the time did people say the aggressor's behavior, the poor behavior stopped. And then what I found is it was just as likely that someone would leave the organization they were with if they had been on the receiving end of it, as it would be that the person who had done the bad thing would be asked to leave. So the people leaving wasn't as common, and speaking up, formal complaints and poor behavior stopping weren't common either. So thinking about that and just reflecting on microaggressions, I'll just give you some examples of some that I've experienced through my career. So a really common one when I worked in mining is we'd be standing in a group of people, probably assume that I'm the lone woman in the group, and someone would swear, and then that person would usually look directly at me and apologize. And so I have no problems with swearing. I'm not rolling my eyes when they're swearing. I'm probably swearing too. But yet they would feel that they had to apologize to me because I was the woman in the group. So in those instances, it was really pointing out that I was different and making me feel like I didn't belong in those situations. There was another common too around the sites that I worked at was that I would see people would often, leave homophobic or sometimes racialized comments around the site and sometimes scratch them into dust or write them on the walls and those kind of things. So there was lots of examples of that too. Then sometimes there was more overt discrimination. One time, when I was pregnant with one of my daughters, someone said, "Sorry, Jocelyn, there's a really important project that the site's going to be leading. We think you were the right person to lead it, but you're pregnant." And so, normally that shouldn't happen. There's human rights legislation around that, but anyways, it did. And then another time finding out that I was being paid 50% less than my male colleagues who were at the same level as me in the organization. And I know that wasn't just something that happened to me. Association of Professional Engineers of Alberta did some research a couple of years ago, and they looked into pay inequity within the engineering and geoscience professions in Alberta, and they found, similar to the pay gaps across all of Canada, that there's pay gaps within our professions as well. And so it works out to that the gaps are pretty small early in one's career. And as people get more senior, the gaps grow to about 11%, which is similar to what it is within all professions across Canada as well. And so when we think about microaggressions, sometimes if we let them go unchecked, they can lead to harassing or bullying type behavior. And in these instances, when you're subject to kind of bullying, harassing type behavior, you constantly feel on guard. You're kind of like just always in a stress situation. And it's especially challenging when the person who might be harassing or bullying you is in a position of power. So if they're in a more senior position than you, it can make it really difficult to speak up. So when I felt like my boss was bullying me, I ended up leaving an organization where I loved the work that I did. I liked the coworkers I worked with, but it just wasn't worth it. So whether you're in a leadership role or it's something is happening to a coworker or a friend, it's important that you understand that sometimes these seemingly small issues, they can escalate. And you don't always know if something that someone's experiencing and they're telling you about, that might be the 10th time that week that they've experienced it and they're just feeling like they need to speak up about it now. So one of the most important things you can do if someone does disclose to you, if they're facing some challenges, is believe them. Just validate that the person telling you something is telling you the truth and ask how you can help. So let's get into talking about help. So here's a picture of my husband. He, a couple of years ago, worked on doing his MBA, and I was still at the time working on my PhD, and it seemed like a lot that he was going to take this on, but I wanted to try to make it work for him because he'd been really supportive of me going back to school and kind of pivoting in my career. So we did a lot of brainstorming ahead of time, trying to be proactive about how we were going to make this work. And we identified a few areas that, there were some risks around it. And so, like I mentioned, my daughters both play soccer. And so there's a lot of, they're not quite at driving age yet. So there's a lot of just taxiing them around to get them to different things. And so when we were trying to figure out how my husband could go to school and do his MBA, while mostly working full time and life carrying on for the rest of us. We knew we needed to make some changes and we needed to call in some other people from help. And so when you're thinking about kind of, whether or not you need to ask someone for help or whether or not you can help someone else out, I think it's really important to kind of do a capacity check and do a scan and just be like, how much wiggle room do I have? Like, do I feel like I'm at the limit right now? Then maybe I'm not in a position where I can offer to help to people and maybe I actually need to be asking for it. So if someone does does ask you for help, I think, and you're considering saying no to them because you're feeling at capacity, try to have those conversations face to face with people. Just try to gauge how they're seeming, are they calm or are they agitated or stressed or emotional? So that's an important piece. So back to how do we survive an MBA and a PhD and all of that at the same time and still get our kids to soccer. So we're very fortunate that our daughters ended up being on the same teams with another family that lives quite close to us, and they had two daughters that were on the same teams, and so we set up a group chat and we started carpooling with them. And it became a huge lifesaver for us because there was times that I wasn't able to drive them, that I had other commitments going on. I was maybe traveling or had other commitments, and we still made sure that our kids got to do something they loved. And then it was really cool because a few months after that, an opportunity came up for the husband of that other family to get to go work in Europe for part of the year. And they felt more comfortable saying yes because they knew they had us as a support system and we could work together and we could make it work between the two households. So sometimes it's kind of neat and it works that way that we can collaborate together and we can kind of make things work for multiple people. But we don't know until we ask. So we need to sometimes ask for help. And sometimes it can feel like a bit of a weakness to be like, oh no, I got to figure it out on my own. But I think we're meant to be in a connected, collaborative society. So I think it's important that we ask for help when we need it. So maybe right now or maybe later tonight, maybe have this discussion with your partner or coworker in the near future. But just really thinking about who you might need to call in for support or where you might need support in your life, both at work and in your personal life too. And this can be like as simple as, coming to the realization that maybe you need a cleaner to come in once in a while or skip the dishes or HelloFresh or whatever it is just to help, make everything work. So whatever support might look like for you in your life. Okay, let's get into micro acts of inclusion. So we're going to skip over the realizing stage, the green stage here. We can spend many hours kind of going through all of those elements. If you want to learn more about the realizing stage, download that free download that I have at the end. But when we get into the next stage here, this is really where the action starts happening. So in that leading change stage, in that final stage. So, allyship is this practice of inclusion. It's about building habits that you can be an active ally. And there's two key forms of allyship. We have proactive and we have reactive allyship. So, proactive are those things that we can plan and schedule. Maybe it's agreeing to be part of a mentorship program. Maybe it's coming to things like this tonight. And then those reactive elements of allyship are when somebody says or does something that crosses the line for you and you need to speak up, you need to intervene, you need to reset the tone. We can also think of allyship sometimes too as kind of the big things. So maybe it's when we come together for National Engineering Month. Maybe it's when we're rewriting a policy or we're organizing an event or we're coming together and learning with other people. But we don't want to just do the big things because we could maybe fall into an allyship trap of being performative or a savior allyship if the only thing we do say to support Indigenous people in the year is to wear an orange shirt on National Truth and Reconciliation Day. That's maybe not moving the needle enough. So we can think about micro acts of inclusion as a way that we can help do that. So it could be things like championing a woman's ideas during a meeting, maybe when we're assigning a new project, really thinking about are we giving equal opportunities to everyone in the team, making sure that people have equal opportunities to maybe engage with clients or to go to networking events, go to conferences, those kind of things. And of course, those reactive elements of allyship where someone, makes a sexist or racist or homophobic comment that we call it out or we call it in a way that resets the tone. So those are some quick examples of micro acts of inclusion. And then the last thing I would just want to touch on is reinforcing inclusive behavior. So the goal behind this is really to normalize inclusion. And so we can think about how can we, rather than waiting for like those big opportunities to share things, how can we kind of build inclusion into our everyday? And so we can normalize it maybe by switching out a safety share that we might have at the start of a meeting with some sort of micro learning around allyship or inclusion or something that's happening around the world right now. And maybe we could introduce why it's important to use our pronouns or talk about land acknowledgements. Or even if we're organizing an event, seeking out dietary restrictions so we can make sure that everyone gets a chance to eat, no matter what health issues they may have or allergies they may have. And I think it's always important when we're organizing anything, where we're going to be bringing people together or asking them to do something different in their day to day, that we ask people if they need accommodations, if there's something we can do that would make it easier for them to participate or easier for them to show up. So trying to be flexible and pulling for availability, those are some examples around that. So really, when we're thinking about reinforcing inclusive behavior, it's part of it is just noticing the good around you. There's probably already people that are doing a good job of being inclusive, that are being respectful and being kind and inviting people in and trying to create those elements of belonging and psychological safety. So thinking about how can you highlight their inclusion? How can you celebrate that? How can you give them that positive feedback that that's what we want to see more of around here? And maybe it's even just coming up to them saying like, "Hey, I noticed you did this. Thank you." So really celebrating the individuals who are leading with empathy and curiosity and collaboration, and not just those who are the loudest or the quickest to respond. So thinking about how behavior is rewarded at your workplace or in your community. Okay, there's one last Menti, and maybe some of you have already had a chance to get to it, but thinking about what can you do to act as an ally? And happy to answer some questions around this too. We can have a bit more of a discussion around it in our last few minutes here. But just as you're getting a chance to come in and answer that last question, I'll just start wrapping things up too to save some time for questions. So, at the start of my talk, I shared that you shouldn't have to change who you are at your core to be as accepted as a professional or a leader. I shared with you why you should learn and talk about challenges, how to call in support, how to use microacts of inclusion, and why we should reinforce good behavior. So, as we close off National Engineering Month, I'm asking you to consider the power of allyship and calling on you to incorporate inclusion into your professional practice. So, my call to action for you is to unlock a future where everyone feels safe and belongs within the engineering profession. This month, we reflected on the important work that engineers do to design, manage, and construct essential infrastructure, resource extraction, power generation, manufacturing, and more. We can also imagine a new future where we use our power to uphold human rights and incorporate inclusive leadership as an essential and ethical part of how we work. Okay, I'm just going to see. Okay, there's some things. Well, I will touch on these in a sec here. Um, So, call in your allies and answer the call to allyship. Together, we can create this positive ripple of change. And so, I just want to touch on what people added in here. So, listening and listening again, paying attention to the little things and to be kind. Yes, active listening is a really important allyship skill. And it's just, really approaching listening with being curious and wanting to learn. And the other comment here is giving more attention to cultures, biases, team settings, and how to see inclusive things really are in our space. Yes. So kind of keeping it top of mind. So let's create this positive ripple of change. And if today's talk interested you, don't let that fade. So you can scan the QR code here, and this is the self-assessment download that I was telling you about. It'll help you choose one concrete way to practice allyship within your professional practice in this year. So you can just scan that too. And thank you so much to the Saskatoon Engineering Society for having me close out National Engineering Month. So happy to take on any questions that you may have now too.
All righty. Thank you so much, Dr. Jocelyn. That was a great talk. Very
Good.
rich in content there and some compelling stories there to really get one's attention to consider these things very seriously. Thank you so much for all you do in this regard to make
Yeah,
a
thank
change.
you.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll open up here for questions. Feel free to throw in questions in the chat box or unmute your mic and let her rip. So, do we have any questions?
And appreciate you all giving up a Tuesday night to come be here tonight too. Really want to say thank you for that. So,
Yeah. Okay. So we'll just wait here. I guess while we're while we're waiting for some questions to come up here, I'll probably kick it off here.
Hmm.
Um, so I was thinking here, and you had mentioned there about how Apega there had kind of done gotten some statistics there about pay gaps
Hmm.
and things. What are some of the roles you think some professional bodies can actually play in driving this further driving this inclusive practice? And what have you seen actually actively happening currently?
Yeah, I haven't seen this, but I think something that professional regulators could do, they already do pay surveys, like APEGS does one. But they should include that gender element because it is a big determining factor on what pay is, unfortunately. So I think that's something that they should factor in. So sometimes what that's called in the work that I do is just doing that intersectional analysis. So if they collect diversity data and ask people about pay, then you can do that analysis and you can say, oh, here's where some of the gaps are within our profession. And some of the jurisdictions across Canada have proactive pay equity legislation. Ontario and BC probably are the ones with the better pay equity legislation. Saskatchewan, we don't even have any pay equity legislation. So there's work to be done here.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Sounds good. I see Dean's hand up. Dean,
Hi, Dean.
Yes. Can you hear me okay? Is my volume
Yes.
acceptable?
you're
Okay.
good.
Yeah.
I had a question. How do you know, or what's a good way to gauge if you are being a successful ally? Because like without feedback, it's kind of hard to know if your actions are having the intended impact, but you also don't want to
Yes.
necessarily go and, specifically ask certain individuals if you've been successful, because then you're kind of putting them in a bit of a spot as well. So how do you
Yeah.
kind of organically get that feedback mechanism that you're on the right track, you're doing the right thing,
Hmm.
without, I guess, putting people on the spot or making anybody
Without
uncomfortable.
making it
So
awkward.
it's
Yeah.
just, do you have any tips or tricks to how to kind of make sure you're on the right path?
Yeah, I think part of it is having that proactive plan too, where you're if picking an area that you maybe want to focus on. And so that's part of the thing in the download that I have too is picking something you want to focus on. So I talked about those five equity deserving groups, and
Yep.
maybe for the next quarter or year, you're like, okay, I'm going to do some work and I'm going to learn about, Indigenous people, for example. And then seeking out information, created by people from that group, history about that group to try to learn more. And then I think you do probably have to talk to people. Like talking to people is an element of that, right? And so maybe it's coming in and sharing with people like, hey, I've been doing this learning, I've been learning about this, and like, you know, just engaging in conversation with people, I think would be something. And then I think you do kind of have to check in with the people that you're wanting to support to be like, how can I help in this situation? Probably what you'll notice if you pick a group that you want to support, or if there's, some people that you're working with that you think that you would like to better support and notice things that they're challenges that they're facing, is just kind of even start watching maybe how they might be being treated differently at times. And then you might need to engage in a conversation with them and just be like, you know what, I noticed that this happened in the last meeting we were in. Somebody kind of talked over you and didn't really hear your ideas when you raised them. How can I better support you in the next time that happens to make sure that you're heard? Like what, I could do this, I could do this, would that be helpful? So I do think we have to check in with people to see what they need sometimes too.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah.
answering.
Yeah. Great
Right.
question.
Great. Yes, yes, indeed. And any other questions? Mm. I'll throw another one here.
Sure.
I mean, I could ask all night. But in terms of dealing with biases now,
Hmm.
two sides of it. The bias where you were talking about senior leadership at some point, they may think, oh,
Yeah.
there's no problem. Everything looks great, right?
Yeah. Nobody
There's no-
complains. No, nothing gets reported, right? Yeah.
Exactly. But then another side of the bias where perhaps some people that are actually, the line between not being inclusive and actually underperforming. And
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
instance, someone that might be maybe racially or whatever the other diversity groups you had mentioned there feel like
Hmm.
they're not they're being kind of marginalized there when actually they're underperforming.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a trickier one probably. What I've seen more so is that oftentimes people who might belong to an equity deserving groups feel like they have to overperform to get noticed. Like that's something that's really common that comes up with women in engineering, for example, that they feel like they have to overperform to get noticed when that's maybe not being effective with helping them get the pay and the leadership opportunities that are easier for maybe other people. So yeah.
But then how do you check the other, like for the senior leaders and all of that? I guess it's the
Yeah,
same
to see if people are
getting.
underperforming. I don't know. I guess having those conversations with people too and kind of doing, opportunities, I think, for 360 feedbacks and stuff around people too, so that we can check our bias in those situations because sometimes we might kind of have biased opinions of people, positive or negative, to be like, oh yeah, that person is always doing a great job, and really they're maybe not so much, but they kind of remind me of myself. So then I overlook where they're not doing as good of a job, and then sometimes judge people more harshly that are different than myself. And so that's where we can kind of get into traps around bias. And unless we do some learning around that area, we probably don't even realize when we're making those decisions and kind of being biased in those instances. So that's where it's important, but difficult to sometimes get people over the hurdle to, you need to work on this too. We all need to work on it. We all have bias.
Mm.
Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed. Okay, I see one from on the chat box here says, how do we convince people in organizations that human rights legislation actually apply to them?
Yes, I think we got to talk about it. I think we have to talk about it. And so that's a big element that I do through my training and in my book. And I talk about human rights and the importance of it and have a little bit of a history of human rights. And kind of my one little factoid about human rights is Saskatchewan actually had the first human rights legislation of anywhere in the world. So post World War II, UN was working on creating human rights, the National Declaration around human rights. But Saskatchewan actually got the legislation through first. And so there was a Jewish lawyer, and I point out that he's Jewish, not because of any sort of stereotypes, but because I think it's really important that post World War II, someone that had been belonged to a group that was had had a really negative impact, was advocating for change to happen, and wasn't just advocating for change to happen to benefit people who were like him, but really was trying to put forward human rights legislation that benefited a wide range of groups. So originally, actually, he had women included in there and was looking for support for racialized people and Indigenous people as well. There was just under the Indian Act, that didn't quite happen. And then the gender piece got pulled out kind of right before it went through for approval. So then there wasn't rights for women in that first legislation, but that is what they were working towards. So
Okay. Do we have any other, thank you for that. Do we have any
yeah.
other questions there? Any other questions? Okay, maybe I'll
And if
just,
people don't feel comfortable asking a question here and want to reach out to me, I'm happy to answer questions afterwards too. I know it can be intimidating sometimes to ask questions in a group setting, so that's totally fair.
yeah. Okay, maybe I'll just ask one more here. Um, I mean, you're working across multiple organizations and across maybe provinces and things. So,
Hmm.
what, in your opinion or in your stats and the things you've seen, what does the future of inclusive leadership in engineering look like the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, and Juniper and I were talking about this before we started too, but I think having training in this area so that we're kind of upping everyone's level of understanding around things so that people understand what their human rights are within Canada and what their rights are around it, where they can ask for accommodations, where there's maybe gaps and differences. So I think just upping everyone's base knowledge is really important. That was the idea when our human rights kind of systems came into play, is that there was going to be a really key educational element so that things just don't get to a reactive state. So we have proactive kind of human rights activity happening, and that education piece didn't always come through all the way. So I think that's a key thing that we can work on as professionals to just fill in our gaps in our understanding and work to try to do better and really adopt a growth mindset. So that's what I would like to see.
Okay, and when you went out to organizations and maybe brought that piece, have they been receptive generally, or has that
Yes,
just
yeah. Yeah, I'm doing training right now. Well, I've got quite a few people coming into my cohort, the public one that I'm starting this week, and then I have quite a few organizations that I'm doing inclusive leadership training with too. So that's doing in-house training and kind of having cohorts of people within pre-existing teams. So then it's really building up those base allyship skills, inclusive leadership skills within the whole team, so that they can better engage in conversations and help make those positive ripple of change.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. If we don't have any other questions, I'm still not seeing any other questions here. I would like to just request that we all give give Dr. Jocelyn there a round of applause for the great talk that we've received tonight, or throw out an emoji there.
Thank you so much. Really
Um,
appreciate it. It was, yes, and really appreciate you all joining tonight on a Tuesday night and helping celebrate the end of National Engineering Month. So
yes,
this was
yes.
great.
So thank you then, everybody, and thank you once again, and everybody have a great night.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
Alrighty.
you.
Bye.
Bye now.